Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, continuing our series about the fundamentals of marksmanship. Today we're going to talk about trigger control. If you're just jumping into the series, we've been going through the fundamentals of marksmanship as applied to self-defense shooting and my philosophy and approach to them. The reason I didn't put them all in one video, it would make it too long. My videos are as long as they need to be. Some people are like, oh, your videos are too long. They're as long as they need to be. However, I do understand time and your ability to digest something in one sitting is very helpful. So I didn't want to make a movie-length video covering all the fundamentals. I wanted to go through them one at a time, which also helps you if you want to reference a specific fundamental for sharing in a group or talking about or your own personal practice. You want to look back to it and say, okay, you know, here it is versus having to go through the whole video to find it. So this makes it a little bit more applicable. We've already worked through a number of the fundamentals. We've talked about grip, stance, sight picture, sight alignment. We talked about breathing. Now we're talking about trigger control. Hoo boy, trigger control. Here's a topic that we don't ever argue about, right? Again, these are the fundamentals of marksmanship as they apply to shooting, not any specific platform, although methods change based on not only the gun we're using, the firearm we're using, if you will, if you don't like the term gun, but also what we're doing with it. Handgun shooting, this is where trigger seems to come up a lot, but rifle as well. But I see it more in handgun because it seems to be most people spend more time shooting their handguns than they do their rifles, at least depending in the self-defense circles. People talk about pinning the trigger. People talk about trigger reset. People talk about slapping the trigger, talking about jerking the trigger, all these other different terminologies and practices. I like to disambiguate as much as possible. So when I talk about trigger reset, that's riding the trigger uninterrupted. I'm not going to pin it to the rear as the gun shoots because my sights are going to reset fast enough that I don't have to do that. Pinning the trigger slows down my cadence of fire. People might be like, well, why do you want to shoot fast? And I'm like, because pistols are arguably poor man stoppers, and I want to put as many bullets into the threat as quickly as possible to get them to stop doing whatever they were doing that caused me to shoot them in the first place. So being able to shoot as fast as possible is always a good thing. I didn't say as fast as I can. I said as fast as possible. I shoot as fast as possible at all distances. What that means is, at 3 yards, I shoot as fast as I can shoot at 3 yards with accurate hits based on the conditions. At 25 yards, I shoot as fast as I can shoot at 25 yards based on accuracy and conditions. They're not going to necessarily be the same speed based on conditions and distance. But I'm still going to shoot as fast as possible based on the conditions that are existing. And, of course, distance is one of those conditions. It's always going to be a factor. It's one of our 3 metrics that we see in shooting a lot: time, distance, accuracy. My trigger method may change because of that, but before we talk about that, talk about terms. So pinning the trigger. Not going to talk about it because it's stupid. Applied to a handgun, it doesn't necessarily help you, and if it does help you, it's because your grip sucks. Next, of course, is trigger reset, which is the one that's most commonly taught. That's pulling the trigger, the gun fires, you ride it out until you get that click or the reset, and then you're able to pull again. You stay on the trigger wall the entire time until you're done shooting, finger comes off trigger. Which is useful, but it does slow down how fast you can shoot. And sometimes you can shoot faster, and you don't allow yourself to because you're using trigger reset. The next technique we'll talk about is something that people usually has a negative connotation, and that's slapping the trigger. Slapping the trigger, by definition, would be an uninterrupted or an interrupted contact with the finger on the trigger surface. So I shoot, my finger comes off the trigger, my finger comes back on the trigger. That's trigger slap. I prefer to call it trigger reset anticipation because it gets rid of that negative connotation, even though I always just explain to people, you can slap a trigger. In fact, I challenge you to set up a target, get your shot timer, go out to the range, whatever distance, doesn't matter, let's say 3 yards. I want you to draw your gun and fire 1 round in under 2 seconds and not slap the trigger. You can't really do it because that very first purchase on the trigger when you're going to go immediately to shooting is going to be a slap by definition because the contact between the finger and the trigger was interrupted. Yes, you could say, well, that's semantics, and that's only one time, and blah, 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 blah. But if you can do that on the first round and hit what you aim at, why can't you do it on every round? And, of course, the reasoning for why we might want to do that is because I'm slowing down the reset of the trigger by riding it. That might be a technique I use at 15, 20, 25, 35 yards because it minimizes disturbance on the gun to the most maximum level. But at 3, 5, 7, 10, 15 yards, I'm probably going to slap the trigger to run the gun fast based on how accurate I have to be. Jerking the trigger is a bad thing, and some people confuse slapping with jerking, and that's why I kind of use a different terminology when I describe slapping the trigger because it makes people a little bit more ready to accept it, to practice it, to see that it works. Jerking the trigger is a sudden introduction of pressure. So I'm pulling straight and even, and I'm following my sight picture, my sight alignment, and I get the gun right where I want it, and I just go ahead and jerk on that gun. And of course, that's an exaggeration. Hopefully you don't apply that much force, but it can cause the gun to drive in a direction based on where the force is applied and if the grip is prepared for that force. Because as much as we want these two hands to be equal in life, sometimes they're not and we don't even recognize it. You can't win a tug of war with yourself unless you consciously decide which arm gets to win, even though we know one arm is going to be stronger than the other one. The trigger finger can communicate with either hand and force that hand to release pressure in a way that makes us seem like the trigger finger is the cause of all our problems. That's not necessarily true. What's actually occurring is exactly what I described. If you feel like, oh, you got too much trigger finger or too little trigger finger, you should probably seen the pie chart that's floating down there that most people refer to as incorrectly as possible. Yes, I can shoot very accurately with a poor grip, but I cannot do it as fast as possible. If I'm at 3 yards, and I do this in a demonstration in classes, I'll use just my trigger finger and the web of my thumb and my thumb to hold the gun, and I'll put these fingers completely off the grip and I'll shoot an accurate group. And I can take that back to a reasonable distance, but I can't do it as fast as possible. I can just do it. If I put my whole hand on the gun and then I bring my other hand on the gun, I can do the exact same thing at a much higher rate of fire, because I understand that this one little finger is not going to overcome 9 other fingers, 2 palms, forearms, biceps, triceps, shoulder muscles, back muscles, all these other factors, all these other muscle groups, all these other structures that help me shoot the gun well. So when someone has an accuracy problem, the trigger is not the first place I look. It's usually the last. The first place I'm going to look is at their grip, finding out if they're applying equal pressure to the gun. If you remember back to the grip video, we talked about the 4 directions of pressure. I want downward pressure, I want rearward pressure, I want forward pressure, and then I want inward pressure. And trigger doesn't factor into any of that except, well, it's very hard to isolate 100% the movement of my finger from the rest of my hand based on dexterity and just, pre-existing conditions or anything else. So even as I do this, I can feel a little bit of movement in my other fingers. Not much, but a little. If I'm applying proper pressure to the gun, do we really think that little bit of movement is going to cause me to shoot A versus B zone? No. If you're aiming for the A and you hit B, I can almost guarantee it wasn't your trigger finger that did it unless your grip sucks. And that's why I bring that up again. And of course, that's a very broad statement, your grip sucks. What I mean is your grip is inefficient and it can be fixed with application of pressure in the proper 4 directions. Trigger control is important. It becomes more important the further I get away from the target. And again, just like grip, you can have different techniques with a rifle and with a handgun. Even though handgun, usually people are like, oh, you have 2 different grip techniques for your handgun? That's weird. But for the rifle, everybody's like, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. Handgun, same thing. Based on distance, I may change my grip technique on the handgun. I also change my trigger control technique based on the handgun. If I'm back at 25, maybe even a little closer, depending on how accurate I have to be and how much time I have available, I'll go to trigger reset. People are like, oh, but you're such an advocate of this reset anticipation method. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. But trigger reset can be used because I'm no longer managing that recoil because I'm not shooting as fast as I would shoot at 3, 5, 7, 10 yards. So the method doesn't serve its purpose anymore because I'm not going to be breaking that contact to get the gun to run faster. When I get back to 25, and we'll use that as our example, at that point, my biggest concern is maximum stability on the gun. And that's when I'm going to go to a trigger reset method because reset anticipation no longer serves its purpose because of the distance. And because even though trigger is probably not likely going to be the culprit if I have accuracy issues, I'm still introducing a slight degree of asymmetrical pressure into my grip when I pull the trigger. To talk about finger placement, where do I touch the trigger? I think that depends on physiology, how long your fingers are in relation to how big your palms are, and the gun, the firearm you're using and the type of trigger you're using, curved versus flat versus bow versus hybrid versus whatever. 1911 style versus a traditional hinge versus a fulcrum hinge trigger versus a safety hinge trigger. Everything is going to be slightly different based on your personal understanding. I would not take anyone's trigger advice if they just told me something and it was a declarative statement and they didn't understand what gun I was using or they had never really seen me shoot. Yes, you can put too much finger in the trigger. You can, but that's going to be a different story for different types of shooters. So I wouldn't advocate first there, or little there, right there at the notch or something like that. What I don't want to do is curl my finger so far inside the trigger that it actually does pull it back towards the palm when I pull in. I want to press straight back, trigger press. They say pull this trigger straight and even to the rear. That's the only way it goes. What they mean is pull the trigger in line with the bore axis. So I want to pull the trigger straight back along with the barrel. which you're thinking, okay, that's the same as straight in the ear. Not necessarily, because there's an elevation issue there as well. I see some shooters, and I see it more on Glocks than I do some other guns, because the trigger well, the trigger guard, the trigger area is a little bit smaller than some guns like what you'd see on an HK or even an Smith & Wesson MP. Based on the angle their finger comes into the trigger well, they're actually dragging their finger against the bottom of the trigger guard. That's not a good thing. It wouldn't necessarily disturb their shooting ability, but it is going to slow their finger down. So it's something that we want to try to correct if we can, but physiology factors into that. If your finger literally stays there, and you'd have to break and reset your finger at an angle to get it to stop doing that, maybe that's not the gun for you, but more than likely it just requires a different application of technique, because that's a situation that's going to be a constant that we can work around. It's much easier to fix someone's efficiency when there's a constant problem versus when the problem is inconsistent. When it comes to rifle, there's also different trigger pull techniques. I teach reset anticipation for rifle as well. When we get back to those further distances or those precision distances, I tend to do what you've probably seen a lot of people do. I'll actually bring my thumb around and come outside off of the rear, the tang or the back strap, if you will, of the grip, and that allows me to pull the gun a little bit more straight to the rear, keep that trigger in line with the bore axis versus keeping my thumb around and introducing a little bit of asymmetrical pressure, because I don't have both hands on that grip, so I'm not equalizing pressure at the pistol grip on the rifle like I am on the handgun. And that's one reason you see people do that. It also creates a little bit more, or I should say removes a little bit of stress from the grip overall, because in that precision shooting, the most important thing is keeping the trigger as undisturbed as possible. The grip itself on the pistol grip isn't a critical necessity versus the positioning, physical positioning, body positioning, and the other grip on the rifle controlling it. Bipod versus bag versus freestanding, there's a bunch of different factors that go into that, but the rifle, I've got more points of contact to help me create that stability. I got my cheek weld, I've got my shoulder weld, I've got my support hand. Then I've got my control hand for the actual controls and trigger of the gun. So if I have stability on the rifle otherwise, I can remove any possible interference with the trigger itself, or reduce the amount of stress I'm putting on that pistol grip and maybe translating to the trigger by taking my thumb out and around from that trigger, which is why you see somebody do it. You also see people do it back from the old MP5 days, because the selector on the MP5 is designed for people with like comically long fingers. The average man probably can't work that selector with his thumb. I shoot the MP5 and it's safe semi-full, but because that selector is so difficult that you're barely able to get your thumb on it, and as soon as you push down, the MP5 is like, oh, you wanted semi? LOL, here's full auto. So a lot of people will come around and use the other side of the selector to accurately go to semi, or accurately go to 3, or accurately go, depending on which trigger pack's in it. And that's a different technique, and you can use that technique on rifles as well if your thumbs are too short, or your safety's not long enough, or some combination thereof. And with a semi-auto only, it's not really that big of a factor, but if you're having safety selecting issues on a rifle, it's definitely a technique that you can apply. To sum it all up, don't let anyone tell you your trigger is the reason you're not shooting well unless they can prove it. Don't let them just throw declarative statements at you saying you need to put this much finger in there, you need to do this, especially if they're not there with you in person and you're just reading some guy's snarky comments, some smug bastard's comments on the internet. He may or may not know what he's talking about. He may have fixed himself or thinks he's fixed himself. But if we use critical thinking and apply it to the situation, if I had to say there was a fundamental of marksmanship was the least important, not important, but the least important, lower on the list, trigger is going to be one of them. Because all things considered, your grip, your stance, your positioning is going to do more for you to keep accuracy than the trigger is going to do. Doesn't mean the trigger is not important. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if I see someone having accuracy problems, I already said this before, I'm not going to look at the trigger first unless there's a reason to do it. If I see them physically jerking the trigger, then that's when I'm going to address it. Other than that, I'm going to teach them a trigger method that's going to apply to shooting as fast as possible. As fast as possible, it's going to change based on distance, required accuracy, conditions, environment, so on, so forth. Trigger is obviously monumentally important because that's how we acknowledge we take that shot we're going to take. In self-defense, the pull of the trigger is the first critical act, first physical act of the use of lethal force. Not just the display, but the actual use. So it's very important to have a critical understanding and a good efficiency of understanding with our trigger control techniques to be able to shoot as fast as possible. Because there's no off switch in the human body except for one place, and that's the brainstem. Pons, midbrain, medulla oblongata. It's a very small point aim. If you're not able to shoot there based on conditions, distance, or personal skill set, you're betting on, medically speaking, incapacitation due to blood loss. And that takes time because no matter how big a hole you make, you got to have enough blood leak out for them to become unconscious. Now, you could get a psychological stop, but you can't depend on those. So medically speaking, you need to shoot some bullets. And trigger is definitely how you're going to do that every single time. The more efficient your trigger control techniques are, the faster you can shoot those bullets, the faster you're going to stop that threat. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.